Welcome to Orensha PowerShell series. In this video, we're going to be going over improving remote commands. And the main idea here is that we're going to be creating persistent sessions that we can use. And this gives us an improvement over Invoke-Command and enter PS session, which in the ways that we looked at it in the previous video required re-entering the connection information to use those commandlets again. When using persistent sessions, we'll be able to reuse our connections to remote computers in a simple and easy way, allowing us to quickly run commandlets on remote computers without batting an eye. Now, a session is a persistent connection between PowerShell on your computer and PowerShell on a remote computer. This connection stays open, and a small amount of memory and processing power is committed on both computers to keep that connection open. There is very little network traffic involved to keep that connection open, and PowerShell maintains a list of these connections on the computer, making them reusable over time without having to re-authenticate. And for those of you that don't have a remote computer that you can use to practice these remote commands, remember that you can always use localhost to simulate running remote commands, but it is all done locally on your own computer. So to create a new remote session, you use the command new PS session. And this is similar to the enter PS session with either host name or computer name to direct this commandlet to the computer that you're trying to connect to. Now remember, with host name, we're using SSH. And with computer name, we're using WSMan. So this generally breaks down to SSH being Linux computers and WSMan being Windows computers, but you can always set up SSH on your Windows machine and use it using the hostname parameter. Just remember the difference between those is which protocol it's going to be using. And there are some nuances between those two, but you can look at those in the last remoting video that I did to fully understand the differences there. And once you've created a PowerShell session, you can use the get PS session commandlet to get all of the sessions currently open on your computer. So if you run it here without any parameters, it will return every open PowerShell session on your computer that you've created. So in this way, you can create PowerShell sessions and then always get them using get PowerShell session, but it's much more common to store our sessions in a variable. So let's look at an example of this. First, we'll create our session variable, and then we'll assign to this a new PowerShell session. And we're going to use hostname for one of our Linux computers and our computer name. And then we'll specify the authentication method here. So now we have our PS session inside our session variable right here. Now this would be easier if we were on a domain, but I'm not currently. But if you were on a domain, you could actually specify a list of computer names and then have all of those connections stored into a variable, which would turn into an array of session objects. So definitely easier when you're on a domain and you have a lot more power, but PS sessions are just as useful when you're not on a domain, and definitely don't shy away from PS sessions just because you're not on a domain. And something else cool that you can do is you can take multiple session variables here and separate them by a comma and then assign two different sessions to them through the new PS session commandlet, and then specifying our computer name and having that just be a list of computer names. So in this case, we will assign a session object for computer 1 and computer 2 to variables session 1 and session 2. And something to be aware of is that it's possible that this doesn't happen in the order of the computer names you have here. So it's best to then go and check in each of these variables to make sure you know which session object is in each one of those variables. But it is something that you can do here to quickly put a listing of session objects into session variables. Okay, next let's talk about scope. Your sessions are only going to last as long as you have that shell open in which you created the PowerShell session that you're using. So as soon as we were to close Visual Studio Code here, the session that we have created here is going to go away. And to get more detailed, this ties back to the PowerShell process that we have open. So as soon as that PowerShell process is no longer there, all of the variables and sessions and anything else that are tied to that process will be terminated. Although these sessions do consume resources, although they're very minimal with today's computers, but they do consume resources, so it's best practice to simply remove that session as soon as you're done using it. Even if you're not closing out that shell, just manually close that session if you were to be using that shell for an extensive period of time after having that session open. And let's look at the command for removing sessions. So that's simply going to be remove PS session. And then you have a few parameters here. You can use ID, name, computer name, or if you really wanted to, you could use the get PS session and then pipe that into remove PS session. And that will actually remove all of your open PS sessions, making a clean slate for your sessions and getting rid of all of the resources that are being used to keep those connections open. And next, we're going to jump into actually using sessions. So now that we have a session open and we've stored it in our session variable, we can use the command enter PS session. And this commandlet actually has a parameter for session. So we've specified our session parameter, and then we can simply put our session variable as an input there. And just like that, we're able to enter that PS session and start running commandlets on that remote computer. And then we can use exit to pop out of that session. And let's look at the session object a little closer. So if we pipe our session object into get member, we can look at some of the properties of this session object. And right up here at the top, we can see system.management.automation.runspaces.ps session. So we know this is a PS session object, and some of the main properties, we've got ID, name, availability, state. Just take this in, go ahead and run this on your computer, get familiar with the properties of not only this object, but get used to doing this for all the objects that you have. This is going to make you super proficient in PowerShell if you understand the objects that you're working with in the pipeline. Now, let's say you created a bunch of sessions, but you've forgotten what those sessions were. You can always use the get PS session to grab that list of open sessions. And right now we have just that one that we created, but we see that it has an ID. It has the transport that it's using, which would either be SSH or WSMan, and then the computer name. And this basic set here that we're seeing in this table is usually going to be enough for us to utilize to then do something with those PS sessions, like we just saw entering that PS session or removing or disconnecting a session. So now we can use our enter PS session, and we can actually place in our session parameter a nested command for get PS session, and then we'll use the ID here and specify 2 for our ID. And just like that, we are right back into that session. So say we didn't store that session in a variable like we did, we can always use this methodology to find a session and then put that into our enter PS session commandlet. And we can also use get PS session and then filter that down to the session that we want and pipe it into enter PS session. So there's a lot of options, and just play around with it on your own computer and get super familiar with it. And in no time, you'll definitely become a master of using remote sessions. All right, next let's look at using the Invoke-Command commandlet with our session object. So we'll use an example here. So here, Invoke-Command has a parameter for session, and we can just use our session variable that we created. And just like that, we ran git process on our remote computer. So what we're getting at here in this video is that you can use your stored remote sessions to quickly use your invoke command or enter PS session like we saw in the previous video. And by understanding that you have session objects in the background there, you're just going to become much more proficient in using your remote sessions. And next, we're going to look at something called implicit remoting, which really takes remote commands to a whole nother level by creating what is essentially an entire module of commandlets that are pointed at a remote computer. So let's look at an example of this. So we're going to use our Invoke-Command commandlet, and then we're going to take our command and import a module from this remote computer. And we'll just take Microsoft PowerShell Management, and then we'll use our session parameter to specify our session variable. So now we know that the module that we want is for sure imported in that remote instance of PowerShell. And now we can use a commandlet called import PS session. And with this, we have our session parameter and specify our session variable. And then we use a parameter called module to specify that module that we just imported. And then we use a parameter called prefix to specify the prefix for the commandlets that are from this Microsoft PowerShell Management module. So every commandlet that is in this module is going to be imported into the PowerShell process that we're using here, and it's going to have a prefix of rem. This, of course, is something that is totally up to you, but we're using rem here to specify remote. And now all of those commandlets are going to be available to you right inside your PowerShell session without having to first enter a PS session or anything like that. And really, the usefulness of this is that now we can jump back and forth between regular commands and remote commands super easily without having to exit a PowerShell session or anything like that. So now we can run git rem child item, and just like that, we ran git child item on a remote computer that we set up that remote module. All right, let's look at another one. So we can use git rem, and we'll use process, and that got all of the processes on a remote computer. So let's look at another valuable use of this type of command. Say you have a server, and in that you have your AD management module, and you want to use that on your computer. You could import that module using the import PS session, and then run all of your commands inside that AD module right on your computer. So this really gives us a whole new world of possibilities where you may never have to install modules on your computer ever again. You simply can connect to a server and use the modules that are on that server right from your computer. Now, some of the downsides to this are that the results here that we see from git process, these are all deserialized, meaning that I can't take them and use any of the methods on there. But this is really a minimal downside, and if you really need to do that, then you can always jump right into a PS session and use those methods. But most commands are going to have other commands that you can pipe into to bypass the serialization issue that we have for this methodology. All right, and the last thing we're going to look at is disconnected sessions. Now, starting in PowerShell version 3, remote sessions were made much more stable, and it also introduced disconnected sessions. Now, when you disconnect a PowerShell session, it still leaves the PowerShell process open on the remote computer. And this means that you could potentially litter your remote computers with PowerShell processes that eat up valuable resources. And it does pose a cleanup process that you have to manage, but PowerShell does give us tools to be able to do this. And one of those is idle timeouts. And we'll look at that here in just a little bit. But first, we're going to look at one of the more useful pieces of the disconnected sessions, which is reconnecting them. And before we do this, I do want to point out you can only do this with the WS-Man connected computers. So this is something purely between Windows computers and not something that you can set up with SSH. So let's set up a new PS session with a Windows computer. And right here we can see the ID of this new PowerShell session is 3. So let's disconnect that session using disconnect PS session with our ID parameter, and we'll specify 3. So now we've disconnected that PowerShell session, and we can simply run connect PS session with our ID of 3. And just like that, we've reconnected that session. So by doing that, we've actually released some of the processing power that the computer is using to keep that connection open. And then by using connect PS session, we've jumped right back into opening that PS session. So the only downside there is that the disconnected session on the remote computer has that PowerShell process still up and running. So let's go over how to set idle timeouts. So say after an hour or 24 hours, that PowerShell process will close itself if it has not had any activity. And to look at this, we need to look at the WS-Man drive. So we can get the child item of the WS-Man drive in our local host shell folder. And then here inside that directory, we can see there's an idle timeout option here. So we can use this to specify the idle timeout for this, and it is represented in seconds. So here we would specify 24 hours in the value of seconds, and then that way we know that any open PowerShell process on this computer will time out after 24 hours. And I think the default is somewhere in the 84 days range. I could be off there, but it's definitely up there and not something that you'd want to keep as a default if you are opening a lot of processes and not remembering to close them out, or you want the system to manage closing them out for you. So now let's look at another directory that we have in that WS-Man repository. And you do have to have an administrative prompt open. So we'll grab one of those and use our get child item commandlet. And here we can see some of the other options that we have available to us. And most notably here is the max connections. So this is the maximum number of connections allowed on the computer. Even if you had a maximum number of sessions per user higher than this, this is the absolute upper limit. So as you're creating more remote sessions, definitely be aware of these management tools that are available to you to help you automate the cleanup process of your PowerShell processes. And that wraps up this video on improving remote commands. In our next video, we're going to go over scripting basics. Until then, thanks for watching and have a good day.